No one's asking the question. Oh yeah, Mrs. Clinton's being protected by, and was protected, frankly still is being protected from consequences of her behavior at the State Department and subsequently.
You mentioned there's no precedent for criminal prosecution. My fear is there still isn't. There's nothing to keep a future Secretary of State or President from this exact same email scheme. And my real fear is this double-track justice system that is rightly or wrongly perceived in this country. That if you are a private in the Army and you email yourself classified information, you will be kicked out. But if you are Hillary Clinton and you seek a promotion to Commander-in-Chief, you will not be. So what I hope you can do today is help the reasonable person understand why she appears to be treated differently than the rest of us would be.
Welcome back to Genuine Questions. I've mentioned previously that my goal with this series of videos is to demonstrate that we can't always rely on the media to cover certain stories and people accurately, fairly, or with an appropriate amount of journalistic curiosity. I would also like to explain why I feel that it is important to begin by talking about some of these stories that may feel like old news to some people. That is because my opinions about what is going on today and who I do and don't believe to be credible sources of information are largely influenced by how these people and organizations have behaved in the past. When you compare their actions today with how they conducted themselves just a few years prior, it leads me to have a few very genuine questions about why their standards have changed so much. Which brings us to today's topic, Hillary's emails. There's so much to cover on this one that I actually broke it up into 3 parts. Part 1 covers the agreement she violated to keep the Clinton Foundation interests separate from the State Department business, as well as the laws she broke to cover up those violations. Part 2 will go over some specific details of when violations occurred, and Part 3 asks some questions regarding the manner in which the Department of Justice and FBI conducted this investigation. All my sources will be posted in the description, but for the sake of time, I have made a few edits to some of the clips, but my intention is never to mislead, so nothing has been removed that changes the context of what is being said. So with that, I'd like to start by playing this clip of Tom Fitton, president of Judicial Watch, where he explains how his investigation into conflicts of interest regarding Hillary and the Clinton Foundation got started. Without their effort and Freedom of Information Act requests, much of this information would have never become public. So a big thank you to Tom Fitton and all the people over at Judicial Watch.
Judicial Watch is a conservative, nonpartisan educational foundation dedicated to promoting transparency, accountability, and integrity in government politics and the law. Without a doubt, we're the most active Freedom of Information Act requester and litigator in the nation today. And it's no secret that Judicial Watch has had concerns over the years about the Clintons' ethics and respect for the rule of law. So it was with some skepticism we greeted promises by Hillary Clinton in 2008 and 2009 to conduct herself accordingly or appropriately with respect to the foundation as a condition of her being approved as Secretary of State with some skepticism. At the time, even CNN reported that Bill Clinton's complicated business interests could present future conflicts of interest that result in unneeded headaches for the incoming Commander-in-Chief. And to reassure President Obama and senators from both parties, Mrs. Clinton agreed to not participate personally and substantially in any particular matter involving specific parties in which the William Clinton Foundation is a party or represents a party. And additionally, the Clintons promised that the president's speeches and business activities would undergo a State Department ethics review, and that the Clinton Foundation would disclose its donors online and agree to significant restrictions on support from foreign governments, neither of which, to be fair, it wasn't required by law, but was contingent on her being confirmed by the Senate. We obviously had zero confidence that these promises would be kept, and began monitoring the ethics process and filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 2011 to see how that ethics process was being implemented. We were ignored for 2 years by the administration.
So at the time of Hillary's nomination to Secretary of State, there was bipartisan concern over potential conflicts of interest that her work with the Clinton Foundation could influence her decisions at the State Department. And while she was not legally required to do so, her confirmation was contingent on her signing a memorandum of understanding that she would keep Clinton Foundation interests separate from State Department business. When Judicial Watch filed Freedom of Information Act requests to verify she was following these agreements, they were stonewalled for 2 years. But now we can see a copy of her agreement, which is reported on here in the Washington Post. And here are just some of the violations that occurred. They didn't disclose their donors annually. They didn't submit foreign government donations to the State Department for an ethics review. They didn't disclose millions of dollars in speaking fees given to Bill Clinton. And they don't disclose the dates and amounts of their donations. They just list them in ranges. The Clintons are very skilled at parsing out words. She relied on this technicality of, "I will not participate personally," which is a very clever, and I am sure deliberate, use of language. If your intentions are pure and you want to be as transparent as possible, this agreement should also apply to anyone whom Hillary oversees professionally. But as you'll hear in this next clip, that's exactly how she was skirting around this issue.
Had to get permission for her to be Secretary of State and continue to do all the things they did. They got permission, you got the okay, and then they didn't follow it.
The foundation immediately contacted Ms. Abedin, who worked closely with Mrs. Clinton, to start getting things done for foundation supporters, as I've described. And it's not what I described, the emails.
So the secretary, she kept her part of the deal, but she just had her lawyer, her chief of staff sign off on everything. Is that sort of how it worked?
Yeah, Abedin did the heavy lifting there,
Yeah.
In addition to these memorandums regarding the foundation, Hillary also signed 2 other documents after her confirmation as Secretary of State, acknowledging that she read, understood, and agreed to the rules regarding the handling of classified information in government records. Hillary signed a non-disclosure agreement, or an NDA, where she agreed to protect highly classified information, and a failure to do so could result in criminal prosecution. The use of a private server for government business on its face is a clear violation of this NDA agreement. And that's reported on by Fox News. And then you can see here, this is a screenshot of her signature on this document. And while the Memorandum of Understanding was an ethical violation, her use of a private email server was a legal one. Just to reiterate from the last episode, there have been other public officials that have used unsecure personal email accounts. Hillary is the only one that I am aware of that operated her own private server and refused to turn over records once they were requested. There's a whole litany of laws that she was breaking, but I picked 3 for us to focus on today. I want to point out the gross negligence clause of this first law because we're going to circle back to that in part 3. So she breaks this law by using an unauthorized server, U.S. Section Code 793F, and then in an altruistic effort to save investigators the time of reading through her boring personal emails about yoga and Chelsea's wedding, she broke a second law. She broke U.S. Section Code 2071B by deleting the government records. And I suppose we could chalk this up to the only time in history that 2 wrongs have ever made a right, or we can call it what it is, obstruction of justice. Which brings us to the third law, making materially false statements to Congress, U.S. Section Code 1001. This is also covered in 2 other U.S. Section codes. It is obstruction of justice to withhold, conceal, or alter or destroy a document in a congressional investigation, which she did. I could possibly give someone the benefit of the doubt if they had tried to go with the "I signed those documents 2 years ago and I just forgot" defense. But I can't give that benefit of the doubt to Hillary, because her justification was that she did this out of convenience, meaning she knew the rules and chose to ignore them because it was more convenient for her to do so. And it is important to keep that detail in mind as we move forward in this story. And as further proof that she was aware that this was not an improved practice, here she is in 2011 warning her staff to not do the very same thing that she was currently doing. So as I've mentioned before, the media is great at distracting us with a scandal that can be inflamed by one side and justified by the other so they can pit people against each other. And while doing so, they are deliberately ignoring or downplaying stories that would unify people against bipartisan corruption. The more I watch it now, the more it feels like watching 1984-ish state TV paid for by politicians to keep their two-party system alive, which hinges on that notion of you have to vote for the lesser of two evils. How convenient for the Clintons that the media focus and now public legacy of his impeachment was over him lying about a consensual BJ while he was under investigation, and not the accusations that sparked the appointment of the special counsel in the first place. And for those that aren't familiar or can't remember the origins of that special counsel, don't worry, we'll get into that in a future episode of the series, but I digress for now. I think it is fantastic for the Clintons that the focus of her email investigation has been on the mishandling of classified information and whether or not she knew if the marking was supposed to be an uppercase C or a lowercase c. Because it could have been about obstruction of justice, which is really the most awesome aspect of this whole investigation. Why would she delete her emails? It's her own fault for mixing her personal and private emails together. So if she has nothing to hide, why didn't she just let investigators see everything? Why the cover-up? Why commit a secondary crime in an effort to be transparent and show that the first crime was simply a mistake? And I don't care if we're talking about a Democrat, Republican, your personal friend, or a fictional TV character, that behavior reeks of guilt. But let's take it just a step further and look at how she went about deleting her emails about yoga and Chelsea's wedding. Based on this timeline in the Denver Post, Hillary received a congressional subpoena and preservation order for her emails on March 3rd, and then 3 weeks later, an aide had an "oh shit" moment and erased her server with a software called BleachBit. And according to BleachBit's website, BleachBit is a software that scrubs a file out of existence to prevent recovery and hide traces of files deleted by other applications. Another aide admitted in an FBI interview that he broke Clinton's devices in half and smashed them with a hammer, which is a totally normal way for an innocent person to get rid of their cell phone. I could do an entire episode on Snopes and their ludicrous fact checks, but I'll just stick to this one for today. I love how it's rated as a mixture based on the fact that she didn't personally break the devices. In respect to the larger story in which this claim was made, it's of little to no relevance whether she did it or ordered a staffer to do it. That's like blaming the locker room guy for deflating Tom Brady's footballs and not the person higher on the food chain that told him to do it. Low-level staffers don't just decide, hey, maybe I'll risk my job to do something that will make my boss look super shady if I get caught. And this guy, Justin Cooper, admits to doing it. Yet Snopes still rates this as, kinda true, but definitely in no way is it Hillary's fault. As my mom likes to say, if you're gonna lie to me, at least make it a good one. Because now I'm also mad that you think I'm stupid enough to believe that. Not for 1 second do I buy this story that she set up a private email server out of convenience. I'd argue that it's actually less convenient to do it the way that Hillary did. She agreed to keep foundation interests separate, so it seems logical, as well as convenient, to use a separate account for work. And what a more logical, convenient, and cost-effective way than to use the free government account that was provided to her. Incidentally, this would also be a convenient, legal, and secure way to make sure all work-related documents are made part of the official government records. I find it curious that when it came to deciding whether or not to follow the government rules and regulations, she was more concerned about operating at her own personal convenience. But when it came to being the subject of a criminal investigation, her concerns suddenly turned to the convenience of those people investigating her. There's no conspiracy or other side of the story here. If you're going to believe Hillary Clinton, you have to first buy the ridiculous notion that she set up a private email server because that's more convenient than a government-approved one. And then you have to believe that she didn't want to bore investigators with any of her personal details. So she paid for a team of lawyers to search through the documents with the promise to only turn over things that would potentially be incriminating, and that they would only delete boring stuff that doesn't matter. And then she paid for expensive software to make sure that those 30,000 emails, which she says are about yoga and Chelsea's wedding, could never be recovered. It seems far more likely that those deleted emails were about things like, why were we in Benghazi? And other evidence of influence peddling. Avoiding Freedom of Information Act requests seems like a much more plausible excuse to have a private email server than does convenience. So in part 2 of this Hillary email mini-series, we're going to go into greater detail about why she was so keen to avoid these Freedom of Information Act requests. But before we make that Clinton pivot from convenience to coincidence, I want to close this episode with one last clip of Trey Gowdy asking a State Department official a few, at least in my opinion, very genuine questions.
How were you able to comply with FOIA requests in that almost 2-year interim between the time you wrote the letter and the time that she retained care, custody, and control of all of those public records?
Sir, emails are not the only records.
Right, but it's part of the record. So if you received a FOIA request that would have included emails, how would you have been able to comply with that FOIA request, given the fact that you had neither care, custody, nor control of those records?
Well, we would still search all of our records, and we would still look at things like cables, decision memos, other types of documents that we keep to provide a record of what we do, agendas.
So you would have given what you had, but you would have made no representation that what you provided was complete, because necessarily it could not have been complete because you didn't have the full panoply of public records.
Well, we always look at what we have, sir.
Right. You can't give it if you don't have it. Do you recall why former Secretary Clinton said she availed herself of a personal server and used exclusively personal email? Do you recall the explanation given?
My understanding is that the Secretary said that she did it as a matter of convenience.
Well, that's my understanding too, in part because that's what she said. My next question would be, if it was solely for convenience, why not return the records the day you separated from the State Department?
I have no information on that, sir.
Has she provided any explanation for why she retained care, custody, and control of those public records for almost 2 years after she separated?
I'm not aware of that, sir.
Because if you're going to pursue the theory of convenience, I can't really imagine a busier person on the globe than President Obama. Did he have his own personal server?
I have no knowledge.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because you said that you're doing it the exact same way you would with any other public official. And my point is, because of this arrangement that the former secretary had with herself, you're not in a position to do it the same as you would with any other public official, because Vice President Biden and President Obama don't have their personal attorneys going through their emails to decide what to return and what not to return.